violin soloist. They could play at Carnegie Hall one day and then play an outdoor show in Central Park the next day. And then they could be at a small 200-seat venue somewhere else the day after that. And the way it'll sound to an audience member who's the exact same number of feet away from them at all three of those performances will be so radically different.
Hi, and welcome to And If Love Remains. I am your host, Mike Lovett, and I am excited to have on board today, again, our maestro of music, Elias Axel Pedersen. We have done some amazing episodes, especially lately. I'm excited about where things are headed, Elias. Mm-hmm. And so thanks again for being on the show.
Oh, awesome. Sure. Yeah.
And then you have brought to us a wonderful guest, Dr. Brett Leonard. Dr. Leonard is an audio educator, researcher, and freelance engineer, and currently serves as the director of music technology program at the University of Indianapolis. He works on recording projects ranging from classical and jazz to pop rock, including projects with artists such as Matt Haimovitz, the brass band of Battle Creek, Cecile McLorrin Salvant, and Bob Belden under the auspices of his company BLPaudio, and also serves as the chief audio engineer for the Chelsea Music Festival in New York. Dr. Leonard's research focuses on spatial, audio, and acoustics, including collaborations with Sennheiser, NHK, and Skywalker Sound. He is active in the Audio Engineering Society, both as an author and as a committee member in the Central Indiana section. Dr. Leonard is an alumnus of California Lutheran University and New York University and holds a PhD in sound recording from McGill University. And most importantly to us, because this is how we know him, is he recorded Elias's amazing solo piano and duet piano violin albums. And grateful to have you. Thank you so much, Dr. Leonard, for being on the show.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This is awesome. I'm so glad that you got to come and talk to us. Of course, I've known Brett for a long time, so now we get to delve in and hear a little bit about his past and how he came into his field. So, Mike, maybe you're a much better person to ask those sorts of questions.
Well, I love, I do love origin stories, as people know by now, and I am interested. Brett, how did you get? I mean, let's talk about like where did you grow up, and how did you fall in love with audio?
Yeah, I it's sort of a cliche story almost at this point. I started as a musician, like so many people sort of in the behind the scenes of the music business. I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, and I was really active as a percussionist. Through high school, I was playing with the youth symphony and playing in, the school's concert band and marching band and all that stuff, and had a couple of my own sort of side projects. And I think it was my junior year of high school, we decided with one of the bands I was in, we decided we would make an EP. So, as we did, we looked up all the local studios, and there was one super nice studio that no one could afford. And we're like, okay, let's see what else there is. And so we found this great little studio. They had done some really cool stuff, and they were kind of one of the go-tos for local bands. And dove in as a player, and as soon as I set foot in that place, like I walked in and set down my drums, and I was like, this is cool. I love everything.
Right.
So yeah, I sort of just.
By the way, I have to ask, because we are here in Phoenix, so I am curious. Like, what high school did you go to? Where was this at?
Oh yeah, that's right. I keep forgetting. Everyone's all over the place. Yeah. So I went to Paradise Valley High School.
Okay, right on.
And it was a great. I was there at such an amazing time. There had been kind of shakeups, and they had opened new schools, and things had shifted around. And when I was there, we just had this incredible instrumental music program. We had two incredible directors. And at that time, about 1 out of every 8 students at the school was involved in the instrumental music program. So it was like massive.
Great.
Yeah, it was crazy. And, you know, and thinking about that now, it's so uncommon to see that much participation,
Right.
I think. So it was kind of a perfect timing, perfect place, perfect time.
Yeah,
absolutely. Okay. So you walk into the studio and you're like gear heaven, being in the studio, like everything about it just like spoke to you.
Yeah. I mean, it was nothing like I'd ever seen before. And, you know, thinking about it now, having, you know, sort of spent about 20 years now sort of on the other side of things, it wasn't a super fancy place. It was people who were really passionate about what they were doing. You know, they were there to help people sound good and to sort of help that music get out to the world. And I didn't appreciate that until much later. But yeah, it kind of clicked with me. And, you know, we did it in kind of a normal rock session style. So we recorded everybody together and the drums were the focus. We kept the
Which
drums.
nobody does anymore.
Right, exactly. And then it was overdub this, and I think we'll add some guitars and whatever.
Right.
And they were like, you can go, you're done. I'm like, no, I'm cool.
I'm sticking around.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I was done in 2 days, and we did it over like a spring break. So we were there for 5 days, and I think I was done by the end of the second day. And I was there every day for the rest of that week, just hanging out in the control room, you know, kind of peering over shoulders, trying to see what was going on.
That's awesome.
That is great. That's fantastic.
That's the best way to learn something, though. It's almost like an apprenticeship. You're really getting the hands-on approach, and you were still young, fairly impressionable, and you know, could absorb so much of that info that probably most high schoolers don't get.
Well, and you know, I think about it. It's sort of interesting because it didn't feel formative at the time. Like it wasn't this, you know, earth-shattering thing that happened. But fast forward a few years, I get through school, get through high school. I'm playing a ton. I ended up going to a smaller college in Southern California, and had really no intention of doing music as anything but sort of a fun activity. Mm-hmm. So I was playing a lot because I showed up and they had just had a couple of percussionists graduate. And so they're like, oh, wait, percussion's your first instrument? What are you doing Monday night? I don't know. Okay, you're in the orchestra. What are you doing Tuesday night? I don't know. You're in the wind ensemble. It was like, you know, it just kind of grew into
everything.
Yeah, and it was super cool. But I was a business major, and 8 a.m. accounting class took care of that for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, when I kind of had this moment of like, well, what am I really going to do? You know, I know why I showed up here, but is that really where I want to head? I happened to see on the list of electives, there was a digital music class. And all of a sudden, I was back in kind of a small, you know, do-it-yourself recording studio for this class. And that's when it kind of clicked. Man, I really loved doing that stuff a couple of years ago, you know, and maybe this is something that I could actually do beyond just, you know, once every 5 years making a record or something.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Some of the best formative experiences, though, and you don't even realize you're learning so much because you're enjoying it.
Yeah.
And just absorbing it all. And that's awesome. So you kind of made music a career in another way you never would have expected.
Yeah. And I have to say, it was really funny because even after I sort of realized, okay, my heart is in music. Like music is really my passion. So I think it's going to be something with music. I called one of my high school percussion instructors, just amazing teacher, amazing player. And I said, you know, hey, Emma, I think I'm interested in doing music. And she said, you know, I'm so happy for you. We all kind of, you know, talked about it when you graduated and you said you weren't going to do music. We kind of all figured that wasn't right. So they sort of knew. But she said, you know, keep in mind, I went to IU Bloomington and did an undergrad, and then I went to Juilliard and did a master's. And I like sub with the local symphony, but like I still take other you know, like I have like a day job,
Yeah.
Right.
And that was another pivotal moment where it sort of made me examine the music industry in a way that was a little more honest, I think, than some people who are, 19, 20 years old. They're super excited. Yeah, I'm going to be a musician. And
idealistic.
People at a school, it's such a starry-eyed kind of exciting thing. And now being on the faculty side of things, it's really fascinating because I've had those same conversations, and I try to always remember the real honest truth that was told to me in that moment. And try to be that honest with my students or somebody who comes to me for advice, because that made a difference too. It made me look outside of, people think the only thing you can do in music is play an instrument or sing. Right. And there's so much more.
There is. And that's it, and I want to get back to your biography because I'm digging this, but I'm curious, jump to today, where I have a kind of a theory that I don't know if it's a theory, but it's an idea that because of technology, engineering, recording, everybody has a project studio. Everybody has, everybody has it. So it's almost as if, the musicians of yesterday are in the, or I should say the engineers of today are in the same predicament that maybe you found yourself, a few years back of well, maybe, maybe I shouldn't be doing, recording, my buddy's band for free all the time. You know what I mean? In other words, it becomes this problem of, it's great when you're very good at something, but it is a difficult industry to get into, even on the technical end, I think.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I still feel like I'm a reasonably young person, but I talk with my students and I sort of, okay, well, when I started out this, and I see the looks on their faces and I'm like, wow, yeah, things have really, really changed even in, 20 years. It's just really evolved. And now I have a friend who's up at Sweetwater, and talking to him, I don't know, about 6 months after the pandemic really kind of settled in. So it must have been midsummer of last year. And I said, how have things been from you? Have things been okay? Is everyone sort of doing all right? And he said, it's been like Black Friday every single day.
Yeah.
Right. He said, everyone wants a new microphone, a new interface. And I think, come 2022, let's keep our fingers crossed and we're back to normal. I think there will be a 1-to-1 home studio to person ratio in this country. It's crazy.
Yeah,
it is crazy. But the good part about it is you do find, interest, people learn in all kinds of great ways. And it does come down to what is your technique? How good are you? And let's get into that a little bit as far as where did you learn that? And when you made the decision, I want to get in on the engineering side, I want to get in on the recording side. What were some of your I guess mentors, or how did you learn how to work in those environments?
Yeah, I first and foremost was my advisor at Cal Lutheran. He was a super cool guy named Mark Spraggins. He's a composer, but he was very into being able to kind of mock up his own music in a very convincing way. So he was super deep into sampling and synthesizers and sequencing. So he could kind of do the film score thing where he could write something out and then present somebody with something that sounded pretty close to what it would sound like with real musicians.
Right.
And he, when I got there, I didn't really even realize that I was in the only studio at the school, but by the time I finished my first year, they were putting a new studio together. And so a lot of my sort of first few years of learning, it was really cool because it was okay, there's a box of stuff, there's a box of gear and some cable. How does this all go together, And
right.
I took for granted that I learned how to solder. Why? Because if we didn't solder stuff, nothing was going to work.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Really the DIY, do it yourself. And actually, since I've known you, even working with you in the studio, you always seemed like a very handyman type. I mean, always coming up just with, well, let's try this, and maybe it was as simple as let's duct tape this together, or maybe it was or something more complex. We've got to put these in combination here. You know what? You deal with it. You figure it out. I don't know. That's above my pay grade. But,
well, yeah, and that's some of the most fun stuff to me, because like I was a science nerd, as a kid, and so that's still some of the most fun stuff to me. Is like, okay, let's try this. Let's crack open this piece of gear and change the value of some resistor or capacitor. Like you can just sort of dive into that end. And I'm sure that being thrown into that side of it, I was 19 years old and all of a sudden I'm putting together a studio with a faculty member. I'm sure that sort of informed my whole outlook on like, man, I need some more tools and I need I need a new pair of wire strippers. Like, what kid asks for that, But I was like, Christmas, all right, here's an idea.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
I'm a little curious too, like for a musician in the music world, let's say performance world, or on an instrument or voice, we kind of hone our skills, and you go to college and you study with somebody that really teaches you how to play your instrument. And by the way, you brought up some other great points, and I think this is your business acumen as well, that we don't teach a lot of other necessary skills at school. What do you do with this playing ability? But maybe for people that don't understand in the general public, it's already hard enough to explain. Well, you can really get better at an instrument or singing with a good teacher and hone your skills. But then everybody just assumes, a recording engineer. Well, what kind of skills have you developed? Don't you just press play? And I know that's very simplistic, but what are some of the things that you had to hone to acquire such a large skill set and toolbox?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's an interesting skill set. It's a very broad skill set, and I don't think there's anything that I know that there isn't a field that has a much greater depth of knowledge, but it's sort of these bits put together. And so for me, a lot of it was learning about acoustics and learning how instruments work. Because it's sort of incredible to me that you see people who don't understand how a cello makes sound, or how a flute works, or what the soundboard of a piano does, but they're trying to put microphones on it. And
right.
It's such a disconnected thing, if you don't understand where the sound's coming from and where what sound is coming from, you're kind of guessing, or you're imitating something you've seen somebody else do. So to me, that was one of the big, like, not only reading about it in a book or seeing, crazy animations of it, but then being able to immediately apply that and have a cello player that I could be like, hey man, what are you doing this weekend? You want to come into the studio? I'm going to put a bunch of mics on you and sort of figure this out, or associate what I'm hearing with what I read.
That's incredible. That's
awesome.
Yeah,
it is. That's really interesting, because you'll see this a lot, and I don't want to disparage anybody here, but for example, you'll see somebody, miking up an acoustic guitar, and the first thing they do is stick a microphone right in the hole. Yep. And it's like, that's not, I mean, if you really want a boomy sound,
yes, but no,
right. It's like, that's not how it works. But it is that kind of being that intimate with how sound works. I can see just being so huge in what you do.
Well, and it's funny because, that's a great example, the acoustic guitar. There are so many instruments that kind of have a proverbial target drawn on them, and it's very misleading. Right. Same thing with, you see people put a mic on the F hole of a violin or something, and you're like, well, that's probably not what you want to hear,
Yeah.
All of these things where it's like, or people who
That's
might
not the speaker.
yeah,
Right.
or like the bell of a saxophone. People are like, oh, well, that's where the sound comes out. Well, actually, the sound comes out everywhere. So you're sort of zooming in on 1/10 or whatever, and
one
it's
part of the sound.
yeah, it's fascinating, and there's a whole field of study that's all they do is study instrument acoustics, and those people obviously could run laps around me faster than I can blink, but I have enough of that knowledge and kind of try to stay abreast as people sort of learn more and more about decoding these instruments that were designed before anyone cared about acoustics. People just wanted it to sound good. They didn't care which direction it shot. And now we're really reverse engineering a lot of things that were developed before that science existed. And I'm just trying to make sure I'm on top of things. So, if somebody says, if Elias says, man, the sound's too bright. Okay, so where's the highest high frequency sound coming out of the piano? I need to move away from that.
Yeah.
And I sort of translate that into hopefully the sound that the player wants.
Yeah, you think maybe 200 years ago, or 300 or more, when some of these instruments were developed, the social norms and what people were expecting, they didn't have electronic means of verifying or measuring, and the concert spaces and all those things just would have been much different, much smaller usually.
Yes.
So
yes.
just developing a piano, it was enough to make it out of wood and steel, just to get more sound, and turn the lid so it goes out. That was a huge improvement, And now we can get into so much finer detail.
Well, and I even think about things like the orchestra, like how an orchestra is situated on stage, and versus how we listen to, if you listen to any kind of modern, even orchestral piece in a lot of cases, but if it's a like a movie score or something, but if you listen to any kind of modern music, you're going to hear the bass smack in the middle. You're going to hear, the vocals smack in the middle. And then you're going to hear kind of everything else on the outsides kind of, pitter in wherever they might fit. Where on a stage, you've got the basses and the cellos clear off to the right.
Yeah.
It is a completely different acoustical experience that people have.
Yeah. And I think so much has evolved too for all of us. I'm trying to think. The first iPod came out maybe when I was in college or very late high school. And then the iPhone came out when I was in grad school. And the transition from people listening in their cars or, in their living room or something to just everybody sticking speakers in their ears. And that's the only thing that matters.
Yeah.
That's been huge too. And the way that people listen and interpret sound. There's some things that are much less forgiving in the world today of headphone listening than what was available on speakers 15 years ago as the normal.
And I think it affects, at least in the classical world, more. And we talked to Mark Ainley. I don't know if you know about sort of recordings in the classical world and how it affects things. I assume, and I could be a little bit ignorant here, that in let's just go with pop world, the recording, what you hear on an album, let's say, is going to be fairly close to what you hear in a live concert. Obviously, there are differences, and unfortunately or fortunately, the CD might be auto-tuned, so the singing in concert might not be at that same level. But the balance and all that, it's all produced sort of. Whereas, if I listen to a piano concerto on a recording, the pianist is mic'd a lot more. It's a lot more present. And the balance is way off. When you go hear that in concert, often you can barely hear the soloist. Now that's partly a problem of maybe the soloist, but usually just you have a huge hall, much bigger than when the piece was written for a much smaller hall, and just the acoustics you can't really hear the soloist. So how much does the recording industry kind of affect our expectations in live recording, or in a live setting rather?
That's a lot there.
We'll get into some of it at some point. But
it's interesting because when you sort of started down that path, I thought to myself, that's interesting. a lot of people say they hear a CD of a pop act and then they're disappointed in the live performance because it wasn't as jazzy or, you know, full or whatever. But I started to think about it more. If you look at the credits for most major pop tours now, and I'm talking about like real sort of radio pop, you will see on the crew listed a Pro Tools engineer.
Wow.
And
okay.
There's that much playback, pre-record stuff and sequencing and whatever. So it's interesting, as you sort of were talking through that, I was thinking, well, really the magic, quote unquote, magic of the studio, you know, the ability to auto-tune, the ability to add a 16th guitar track because we're bored, you know, all of these crazy things, they really have changed the live world to the point that people expect it to sound the same. And if it doesn't, you know, okay, maybe there'll be a dance break, you know, between the third chorus and the bridge, but why, you know, where's my favorite shaker loop? Where's my favorite 63rd background vocal? You know, and now that's expected. Whereas classical, there's a lot more sort of holistic vibe to things, I think.
And I want to ask you this because I know you did study in room spatial audio stuff, right? And I think that's the other aspect of it, that it's not just the instrument that we hear, but it's actually the room that we hear. And I'm curious, how does that maybe you can give an example or why are rooms, you know, so important to both the recording and how we listen, both in a live setting and in a you know, if I'm setting up a home theater, like a lot of people I don't think about like they'll put up big old speakers, but they're not thinking about like what's the acoustics of that's going on.
That's my favorite.
$5,000 speakers in a $500 car.
Exactly. Right. That is the quintessential, you know, home theater problem. You spend all the money on the fun, exciting stuff, you know, at the store, and you bring it home and you put it in a whatever square bedroom,
cinder block room, and
this is not what it sounded like in the store.
I mean, I think that's something, and I think unfortunately, well, I don't want to say unfortunately because everything's a creative tool, but as we moved into the electronic era, people began to sort of dissociate the acoustic environment from the final product, because it was just a synth. It was just a drum machine. And it didn't matter if I was doing that at home or if I was doing that in some glorious studio or some famous, you know, rock club. And it's kind of a tragedy that has sort of broken apart. Because you could hear the same orchestra. Or let's even go smaller. Let's say the exact same soloist, violin soloist. They could play at Carnegie Hall one day and then play an outdoor show in Central Park the next day. And then they could be at a small 200-seat venue somewhere else the day after that. And the way it'll sound to an audience member who's the exact same number of feet away from them at all three of those performances will be so radically different. And I think about, I sort of missed the real, like the golden years of classical recording. I was a little late to that party, but I have heard stories from mentors and teachers about, well, we're planning this album. I guess we should go look at a couple of different concert halls to record in and find the right one. And, you know, they really understood how big a difference that could make. And these days, smaller budgets, tighter timetables, or just, you know, the inability, I think about what we're doing right now during the pandemic. It's, okay, what do we have? What can we use? You know, there's no choice whatsoever. It's really just trying to make it work. And so we end up with these really weird experiences. I did a piano trio thing that was recorded in somebody's living room. And by living room standards, it was nice and big. I mean, they had a nice Steinway piano in there. It was great. But so radically different than what you expect to hear. You know, it was
Right.
just, you couldn't quite figure out. You're like, well, I hear all the notes and they're playing beautifully, but just something's not right. And that's the acoustic environment. It either glues it together or kind of breaks it apart.
I feel that the recording engineer almost becomes one of the artists that's collaborating. And I know when we worked, on a solo album and a duo album, that we spent many hours over the course of a couple weekends, based on McGill's schedule, figuring out when we can get some tracks. But then there was just tons of hours to listen to things and choose them. And I remember just finding the right way to edit something. I always remember one particular piece. I think it was on the solo album, yes, and just finding that right place to kind of clip, because I had one note wrong in a section and we brought it in from another, like a large section, but I didn't want to just piecemeal. And you're talking about bringing in different acoustics because some pedal was held. I mean, I think it took us, mostly you and me, kind of trying to listen and give some advice, about an hour for that single edit. And I'm sure we were both getting frustrated, but really the editor of that album, the recording engineer, becomes part of the artistic final product, the vision, in a way. And when you mentioned, I didn't even think of this, but when you're saying on a live tour, you'll have the Pro Tools mixer listed, to bring all that just blows my mind how almost overproduced things are. And how much control that person is. And it's like we look to the band member, the lead singer, like, oh, he's awesome. And, it's not him always or her always. It's the guy behind the scenes. It reminds me of that little video that made its rounds a couple years ago. I think we both posted it on Facebook of you see the panning of the amazing sound, amazing voice.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And you see this audio engineer sweating and moving all the dials. And it's like, and the husband's there like, oh, honey, that sounds gorgeous. And it hands over to the room and she's just screeching.
Oh, yeah. Well, I have a buddy who used to work a lot of festivals and things. And he tells a story of, and I can't remember which act it is. So I can't, say who it was, but it was pretty funny where somebody, some computer module broke down and they're carrying it back to get it fixed, and somebody yells out right in front of the artist, "Don't drop the band!"
Well, wow. I've never been involved in that side. Like I've done live sound mostly for jazz and classical. I've never done big arena shows or anything, but I've heard from some friends who are more involved in that world that one of the toughest jobs with some of these tours is that they have a bunch of backing tracks playing, but if the artist, stops singing to dance or something, right, you've got to have your hand on the fader so you can pull it down so you can keep that illusion that, it really was them the whole time. Yeah. It's just kind of crazy.
Play to the click. Play to the click.
Stop lip syncing.
Exactly. Get busted like Milli Vanilli or somebody.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
What drove you more into, was it because of your love of classical music, jazz music? Like what drove you kind of to specialize in those genres?
Yeah, I had the opportunity to go up to the Aspen Music Festival the summer between my junior and senior year of undergrad. And up until that point, I'd really thought of classical recording as you bring a couple of microphones, you set up in the back of the room, you kind of hit go, and that's all there is to it. And going there and watching, it was an incredible group of faculty on the audio side and senior engineers and people who were just phenomenal. And watching them, spend 3 or 4 hours hanging microphones before a rehearsal to really dial in the sound. And then they'd go up after rehearsal and tweak some things. Also, the concert was just beautiful and huge and lush. And it really kind of changed my mind. And I thought, the recording studio is cool, but this is, you think a rock band playing through a bunch of Marshall half stacks is loud, but man, when you hear a romantic orchestra playing Strauss or Wagner, it's incredible. It's powerful.
Yeah.
And I think that just really impacted me. They did Ein Heldenleben was one of the first things they did when I got there. And I was just so blown away by like just the raw power of this incredible 100+ person orchestra and antiphonal trumpets and all this stuff going on. I thought, man, this is just as kind of crazy as any studio production. It's just, it wears a bow tie, you know, it just appears different, but it's really no different under the surface. So,
and it's very live, and the amount of detail that I think about the amount of detail that when, Elias and I talk about piano, that we talk about and that we get into, the amount of detail that must go on to the either the recording or on the, the sound side of things has got to be just immense, and just an intense experience to get everything just right. For that experience.
And it feels more like doing a lot of, especially live classical, you know, when you're sort of, you're doing a dress rehearsal and a concert, and that's what you have to work with. You know, you're not coming back the next day to fix something. It feels kind of like playing. It feels kind of like performing, because just like when you sit down to play a concert, in 40 minutes it's over, whether everything went perfectly or not. So you're sort of hyper focused. That's my favorite part about doing live classical stuff, is you're in the zone. You know, you're on top of it. You've got the score open, you know exactly what's happening, and you're sort of focused just the same as the people on stage, because you're performing along with them. And that's a lot of fun. That's been awesome.
Cool to hear. Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Mike and I do talk about some of these different issues, and I don't know if before we started, even if you talked to him a bit, because not only is he a musician, but he's also a bit of a recording engineer himself. He does a lot of this stuff. So, you know, just some of the lingo, I've only picked it up just through osmosis, I feel, but a little out of my element there. But I love being part of it, and I've always liked learning more about my instrument, mostly piano, and talking to piano technicians, what are these things, and talking to audio engineers and trying to learn their language too, because that will make my playing better and hopefully the recording experience better, and we can get to a final result. So I actually have a couple questions that might be tough to answer, and they might seem like slightly naive questions, but they're things I get asked as a pianist. So one of them is always, what's the hardest piece? Or what's your favorite piece? And so I want to ask you, as a recording engineer, and if this is too silly, whatever, that's fine. But is there an instrument or instruments that is the hardest in a way to record? And, you know, there could be different parameters for that. And is there an instrument or instruments or voice or whatever that you're most comfortable, or you're just like, I love doing this?
No, that's a totally fair question. And it's, I think it's surprising to some people, and even young recording engineers, as they're sort of honing their ears, sometimes they don't think about the difficulty of the nuance. But actually, solo piano and voice and piano are, I think, two of the hardest things to really get right.
And why? And there's no pressure to say that. Yeah. I kind of thought you might go that direction, but why?
Well, you know, voice and piano is the easier one to answer the why, because more than any other, you know, if you grew up and your parent played violin, you heard violin from the womb, you know, you've heard it literally your entire life. You still will understand and hear the human voice more than any other source in your life.
Yeah.
Even if it's a different language or speaking words you don't understand, we have such a connection with that you can instinctively tell, even if it's a singer you've never heard performing a piece you've never heard in a language you don't know, you can still say, something's weird about that voice. Something doesn't quite, you know, it's just so ingrained in us that when you do a voice piano thing, there's not a lot to cover up anything that's going strangely with the voice. And so people just know right away. They go, something's weird. Something doesn't quite sound right. And
so it's just the expectation level. You've got to be so precise and perfect.
Yeah. And then you couple that with the range of dynamic. I mean, I think about, I actually just earlier today was working on a piano and soprano album, and going from just the quietest, softest, most intimate whisper to this kind of incredibly powerful, full voice, high note in a couple of seconds through, maybe one or two bars. It's really incredible and tough to capture.
Gotta keep that noise floor low.
Exactly. Yeah, you got to keep the noise low, and when you're mixing, you might have to help to make sure that you don't lose connection with the voice, but then back it off before it gets crazy bombastic. So that's an interesting one. And piano is man, it's like you're lost in the woods and you just walk in circles. And every time you walk in another circle, you learn something new. I've recorded solo piano so many times, and every time I do, I get a little bit more nuance. I hear a little bit more. And you, of all people, know, the nuance and detail and subtlety in a piano. There's so much there. There's so much depth. And you might record it and you're like, oh, okay, that sounds like a piano, but does it capture that artistry and the subtlety and the just detail that lies in every single, finger movement? That it's, I've made some okay piano recordings, and I think yours turned out really well. But
I'm very happy,
still, like, one day I'm going to make a piano recording and I'm just going to be like, that's it.
You might, that's okay. It's always searching for that is also fine. That's part of the artistic side of things. You never reach perfection, really.
And I think that's why, like, for example, we talked earlier about samples and things. Like, I own some piano sample libraries, some pretty expensive sample libraries. And I just, as much as I play them, I cannot get the same. It's impossible. You cannot get the same feel, the same touch, the same nuance that you can from an actual real live wood, and steel piano. It doesn't happen. And it's because they're just as well recorded as they are. They're just recordings.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the room matters so much too with the piano. I think about the length that you hold a note, the length that you hold a fermata, the pause that you let happen. There's a grand pause. How much time do I leave? That's going to change if you're in a small room or a big room or a medium room or a bright room or a dark room. And I can't imagine, having only, if you have a sample library and you're trying to perform in sort of a classical style, not having that information kind of right back at you has got to be very difficult.
Yeah, that starts to affect interpretation too. Because the rhythm might be slightly, if you hold something longer than the relative lengths of notes, you start thinking in a slower, faster tempo. And a lot of things are affected, and it's a snowball effect. That's fascinating to think about. I was wondering too, if you feel, it's nice to think that artistically, like, we're always trying to perfect things. And are there any pointers or certain things you've picked up from either recording piano or recording other instruments where it's like, oh, that's a big aha moment, right? I just would have never thought of it that way. I don't know. Some little gems.
Oh, man.
I mean, I'm sure there are hundreds, but
that's a great question. I think, and I was just kind of reminded of this again. It's something that you just kind of have to keep on the top of your head. But sometimes it becomes really easy to kind of put up a figurative wall where there's a literal wall between the musicians and the engineer, and you start to focus on only how things are through a microphone. And, one of the most important things you can do is listen to what you're actually recording with your actual ears in the room. Sometimes you put some microphones up, the person shows up, they start playing, you go, okay, it's fine. And then you walk out and you go, wait, that sounds totally different than what I thought it sounded like. And, you really have to go back to the drawing board. Okay, how do I capture that sound? That player plays different than I was expecting, or that instrument speaks differently than I was expecting. So I think making sure that you really connect acoustically before you try to put a bunch of electronics between point A and point Z is a good thing to remember. And I also think for classical, I think it's interesting. People, because classical music tends to be sort of typified by somebody on stage facing an audience, and the audience is in front of them, and that's how they hear that music or how they see that music. People get really stuck in this sort of concert mentality, but there's such cool things you can do when you're not bound to that. If you're just doing a recording, you don't have to have everyone facing the same way. You don't have to have the violin player next to the keyboard of the piano. Maybe they could be in front of the piano or facing the piano, or, you know, like there's these other options. And since
I think we played around with that a little bit.
Yeah.
With, hold on. We were kind of in a situation where we probably wouldn't be like that in a concert hall, but just the balance and the sound and the connection seemed better.
Exactly. Yeah. It's, people are so used to seeing it one way because they're used to seeing it live that people sort of eliminate possibilities for no real reason, just because that's sort of what they're accustomed to.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the artistic side that you bring to it too. So, you know, opening up all those different options. It's funny, back in we were talking about the orchestra setups and thinking of the cellos on one side. And I've seen a lot of orchestras which try, even in live performances, to change the position of the instrument groups, mostly in the strings, maybe for a certain piece or to get a different balance, because maybe they want cellos closer to the first violins. So I've seen them there, and then second violins or violas on the outside, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can tell a difference when you record.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I love split violins, having firsts on one side and seconds on the other. Mm-hmm. There's so much music that was written either for a smaller environment where you could sort of hear that distinction more apparently, or that was written for being seated that way, where you listen to it with firsts and seconds right next to each other, and you hear kind of a smeared melodic line or smeared motifs. But then when you spread them apart, and now it's this kind of stereo effect, you hear a conversation, and the first say something and the second say something back. And yeah, that's
so I'm
like
curious,
my favorite thing
in
on
piano,
earth.
or at least in classical music, there's this whole historical performance movement. I would say it's really gained momentum the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
And even the whole field of ethnomusicology is fairly new. Musicology is a little older, but do you find that in the recording field, there's also this sense of, well, you know, how would a 19th or 18th century audience hear a Mozart symphony? And it's not just about putting the orchestra members, maybe paring it down in size, moving them around, but what can we do from a recording audio standpoint to make that experience more authentic, per se?
Kind of like colorizing the World War II videos, right, so we can, like, what do they actually look like, not what we imagine them as.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like there's less of that. Well, you know, you think about recording as a medium, and it's brand new. I mean, it's the infant in the musical world by leaps and bounds. And so I feel like there's a little less of that, but there's definitely the movement, especially in like indie and lo-fi music, where people are saying, you know, yeah, man, let's go back to using like 5 mics total, and we're going to do the whole thing. You know, we're going to keep it natural. We're going to keep it simple. And so I think there is some sort of retro approach, but I think it's maybe less widespread than in certain disciplines. Because you're right, there's definitely that question of how was this intended to be, I feel like is very prevalent in a lot of classical music today, even if it's not a period ensemble or an ensemble with that intention. But in recording it, I think it's
authenticity.
Still the big question is, how will people hear this? I think that's the, you know,
well, and that's such a big topic in a way, because it's funny, because like, how do people hear this? Well, how do people hear, like, from one side of the concert hall versus the other? How do you, like, it's almost like we're giving people more of the feeling of what they think they should hear as opposed to what they would actually hear. If that makes any sense at all.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, it's sort of funny when you think about, you know, my starting setup for a large ensemble on a stage, recording session, live concert, kind of either or, is, you know, 2 or 3 microphones sort of up and above and back a little from like the conductor or that center stage point. And you're like, oh yeah, that's cool. That sounds really natural, whatever. And then you look down at the concert hall and you go, well, no one's sitting there. So clearly that's not.
No one's floating in the air.
Exactly. No one has ever heard a concert from there. You know? So it is this kind of like, well, I guess, but not really. You know? We're kind of making it up a little.
But that's the whole thing. It's just like any other art. It's almost more about the intention, the feeling, it's like when we go see a World War II movie, like those things didn't actually happen, but it gives us the impression of it. You know, it's like, okay, I can understand better what it might be like, or have those same feelings maybe.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the big changes between live and recorded audio, and now again recorded audio to recorded audio in service of video or partnered with video.
Yes,
is I think about when it's just an audio presentation, you have to accentuate certain things that your eyes would fill in for you. You know, if you tell you're in a concert hall, you don't need to hear any more concert hall to know that. You can look around and say, I'm in a big concert hall.
Right.
But when it's just audio, when that's all you have to go on, you almost have to accentuate that to fill in.
Put a microphone facing the audience.
Yeah, you know, whatever it might be, to sort of fill in that little bit of extra information that clears up the missing senses.
And let's talk about this for a second, because I think it's such a fascinating, we're in such an interesting time with the pandemic that's happened. And I mean, we could probably talk for another 2 hours about the changes and what people's perceptions are, and how to deal with non-concert concerts and all sorts of things like that.
Right.
But video has become, you know, obviously YouTube, I think has changed the world.
Yes.
You know, and as much as MTV changed a little bit, like that was, compared to that, this is like a atomic bomb in the world of sound. Because the visuals are so present and so there. Talk to me a little bit about video. You mentioned a little bit, but video, and specifically the pandemic, and as people have moved into a more video setting, either for podcasts, either for music concerts. I mean, there's tons of recitals. There's you know, I teach, and so, you know, I may be doing a recital online. You know, all these things have changed. Talk about that.
It's crazy. I think we were moving there in a lot of ways. Like you said, you know, MTV was, you know, the first atomic bomb, and YouTube is the hydrogen bomb. You know, it's 20 times bigger. It's kind of like this Goliath that has really sculpted the world. But I think what's interesting is in both of those cases, you see it was popular music, it was rock music, it was pop, it was hip hop, it was rap that drove a lot of that change. And so what's been entertaining to me is to kind of watch classical music that was in a lot of ways resistant to some of these changes, and consistently resistant. You know, it's sort of a very established, trying to think what the word is. In technology, we'd call it a slow technology, meaning it's gone through a lot of evolution, and it's kind of reached its pinnacle stage, you know?
Okay.
So there's not as much evolution happening, and that's what was happening with video. I went to the concert hall of a nameless orchestra in the United States. They had installed 12 brand new, beautiful pan tilt zoom 4K cameras, which at the time they installed them probably were between 15 and 20 grand each. They'd built an entire control room. They'd done all this stuff. So they probably put $1 million plus just into equipment, and then they found personnel and everything. And they were like, we don't really like it. And they did 3 shows, and they haven't turned it on since.
Wow.
And that was before the pandemic. And then you get some other orchestras who had done the same thing, but were keeping up with it and were generating content. And you look at the who has sort of come out okay from all of this and who has really suffered. And it was those orchestras, those entities that were more willing to evolve, that have kind of weathered the storm a bit better than the ones that were resistant to the media approach. I know that's sort of
point
off from what you originally said.
But that is such an important point, because it's what are you willing to do to stay relevant in a changing world? And I think, even, and this is a totally off the subject thing, but I think about that in terms of like copyright infringement things with YouTube, and, and here are guys, I think guys like Rick Beato, who puts out these amazing video teaching courses basically for free, and then some artist is going to say, no, because you use my music to teach somebody something, I'm going to not let you do that. And the problem isn't, it's so short-sighted. It's so like, wait a sec, you're not going to be relevant in 50 years if you do that. You realize that?
Yeah. Well, mostly I would say it's the companies that are doing it. There's a lot
of that, like, immediate protection of monetary whatever, and like, man, you've just got to stop for just a second and think about like the long-term ramifications of some of these things. It's the copyright thing has blown my mind of late. I still hope that if there's a silver lining to the pandemic, that maybe the way music is treated online will sort of change, because it's real hard to put together a program of 50 or 60 minutes of music, put it on YouTube, and not have a problem with copyright. It's incredibly difficult.
You're guaranteed to.
Even if it's stuff in the public domain.
I get copyrighted on my own stuff.
Yeah.
It's wait a second, I wrote that. But and
if you're not a big record label who has a department that deals with it, getting through that process of just getting your own money back is difficult. I mean, it's a world that's.
Sorry, I wanted to go back to the sound and the video stuff, because I think that is what your point is so important is as human beings, like, how do we experience stuff? Well, yes, we experience through our ears, but man, if you can couple that with sight, and if you can do something powerful, that's a big deal.
It's a much more engaging media form. It's, in our everyday lives, our sight is kind of king of all of our senses. If we have a question where 2 things don't make sense or are in conflict, we pretty much default as humans perceptually to rely on our sight. And being able to engage that, I feel like if I hand somebody a CD of music that's wonderful, that's going to get 10% traction. But if I can show them the music, all of a sudden we're 50 or 60%. Like, just that engagement and engaging more than one sense is massive. But it's challenging from an audio perspective, because now, you've got, I keep going back to orchestra because it's an easy example, but the bassoon is playing the melody. And so there's a close up of the bassoon. If you act the same way as you would on a record, where the bassoon still sounds kind of far away or something like that, now you have a mismatch between video and audio in the contrived world of video, so it's interesting. People have to adapt.
That is so important. It's
a little nuance.
No, it's huge. It's like turning up the synth track, all the way to 10, and it's and because that's what you're looking at. That's what you're going to hear, what you're looking at.
Yeah. That is, and the best example is non-musical still. If you watch a film that has bad ADR And so you see the actor's mouth moving and the words don't quite match up.
Yeah.
Everyone just loses their mind, and totally understandably. But like, I feel like music never had to deal with that as much. And now we have a similar situation where it's like, well, the violin is, you know, a full screen shot of this one violin player, but we hear mostly bass.
Yeah.
Well, you know, my brain doesn't get what's happening, you know, and so we've had to like adjust that it's not just about the music, it's about the music plus the other sense.
I did a video shoot a few months ago, and I saw it, and I'm looking at it, and I just know, I mean, I know what happened. You know, the video guy doesn't play the piano, doesn't play the keyboard. And so he's taking the best shots that he can take, and it ain't matching what I'm hearing.
Yep. Yeah. Wow. That's fascinating.
And anyone who knows will just be pulling their hair out. You know, that's not what that key does. That's not what's happening.
Yeah. Well, that's
my favorite, because I was a drummer, so is when you see a music video and somebody's playing the hi-hat and you're hearing the ride cymbal. I'm like, this is killing me. I have to turn it off. I need to leave. Like,
exactly.
Cognitive dissonance at its finest through music and video.
Right. You know what? Let's do this. I want to ask, just we're kind of coming short on time anyway. Let me ask you this, because of the pandemic, and we talked about expectations. We talked about audience expectations. We talked about, and I loved what you talked about doing the piano trio in a home. Talk to me about, like, what have you seen from a recording aspect? I don't know, maybe a tip to help us get better recordings at home. What have you seen, or where do you see things going? Or how, maybe a better question is this: how has the pandemic changed the venue of concerts and recitals and that sort of thing?
I think there's going to be some real upsides, as horrendous as it has been. I'm hopeful. I feel like, first and foremost, I feel like live music is about to experience an incredible renaissance, because I think everyone is excited to hear live music again. But I think maybe out of all of this, people have realized that there's a whole world out there that they can make music in. It doesn't have to just be the club you're playing at or the concert hall you're performing in, that there's more to the world than just these places that we sort of confined music. Because there have been some amazing things that have happened in people's living rooms and, you know, people's backyards. There have just really been some amazing moments in music. And I think that maybe people will think less in the box going forward. They'll be willing to explore these things because we've been forced to now.
So well put.
Absolutely. Well, I feel like there's so much we could discuss here.
I know, right? This is too much fun.
I know, it's been a blast. Let's do a part 2 sometime. Let's get together. Let's have another conversation if you don't mind. All right.
Yeah.
Let's put that together. Dr. Brett Leonard, thank you so much for being on And If Love Remains. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, is there anything that you're doing that people, you know, want to support you? Is there anything like that that you want to throw out there?
If you want to get in touch, if you want to you know, bounce questions off me, whatever, I'm always happy to chat. My company's website is BLPaudio.com. So there's got my email on there, phone number, all that good stuff. So you can give me a shout there. I'm always happy to touch base. And then, I'm just excited. There are so many cool artists that I'm working with right now that are finally getting back to making music. So hopefully people will see some of this stuff getting out to the world soon.
Fantastic. We'll definitely do that. And we'll put that information also in the show notes.
Awesome.
Thank you, Dr. Leonard. I really appreciate your time.
It's been a pleasure.
Great. I'll try to set up a part 2 when we get around to it. This would be a lot of fun. There's so many topics.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, Elias, for putting this together. Again, you've been listening to Mike Levitt, and this is And If Love Remains.